Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 279, The Inquisition, Structure and Organization. From its very beginnings, Isabella and Ferdinand expected the Inquisition to be under the control of the Spanish crown. This was a huge change in policy compared to the medieval Inquisition, which was a papal institution. Oddly, Pope Sixtus IV decided to go along with this idea, indicating just how far the power of the Pope had fallen since the High Middle Ages. Thus, the Inquisition was, in every way, an instrument of royal policy, and remained politically subject to the crown. The central organization of the new Inquisition was a council, called the Consejo de la Suprema y General Inquisición. Crucially, this council was dominated by one of our remaining monastic orders, the Dominicans. The Dominicans were generally opposed by the Jesuits, the other major monastic order to survive the end of the Middle Ages. Often, writers seeking to get books published sought to exploit this rivalry. And, in fact, by the late 17th century, the Jesuits, thanks to lobbying and politicking efforts, had become influential in the Inquisition as well. In terms of its overall structure, the new Inquisition was modeled, essentially, on the medieval one. Though this was a new institution, inquisitors in the 15th century had to rely on the earlier model. There simply wasn't any other precedent to follow. So inquisitors followed, right down to the last detail, the 13th century practices for arrest, trial, procedures, confiscations, and even recruitment of personnel. Oftentimes, this is why, say in the 17th century, the Inquisition both looks and feels so anachronistic, so out of place. The Council of the Inquisition, sometimes known for short as the Suprema, was presided over by the Inquisitor General. All authority exercised by inquisitors was at one time held to be direct delegation from the Pope. But later, this was modified to the opinion that it was the Inquisitor General himself who was actually delegating the papal powers. Though he might be nominated by the crown, only the Pope had the power in the end to appoint him, though the Pope always followed the Spanish crown. Growth of the Inquisitor General's power was modified by the increasing authority of the Suprema. The relationship between the Suprema and the Inquisitor General was never satisfactorily settled, because they usually acted in concert and neither disputed the other's supremacy. But there were several occasions when the council attempted to take an independent line. In the early 17th century, the Suprema consisted of about 6 members. These usually met every morning and 3 afternoons a week. The afternoon sessions, normally on legal business, were attended by 2 members of the Council of Castile. Correspondence was divided between 2 secretaries, one for Aragon and one for Castile. Members of the Suprema were appointed by the king alone, and the Suprema usually issued orders without need for any vote by the Inquisitor General. When divisions arose in the council, a decision was taken by majority vote, in which the vote of the Inquisitor General didn't count for any more or any less than any other member. The growth of the Suprema's authority led to greater centralization. This, in turn, made the institution even easier for the Spanish crown to dominate. Remember, there were huge legal and procedural differences between Castile and Aragon. The Inquisition was the only institution that spanned both with any real success. Now, the tribunals themselves, those that actually tried people for heresy, in the early days were itinerant. That is to say, they traveled, much like how judges maybe in colonial America rode the circuits. Each tribunal was to consist of 2 inquisitors, a jurist and a theologian, or sometimes two jurists. There was also an assessor, a constable, a prosecutor, and all kinds of other necessary subordinates. The number of personnel grew rapidly throughout the centuries. By the end of the 16th century, the major tribunals of the Iberian Peninsula had 3 inquisitors each. Now, contrary to the image, still somewhat current, the inquisitors of small-minded clerics and theologians fanatically dedicated to the extirpation of heresy. In the 16th and 17th centuries, inquisitors were nothing more than bureaucrats. Elite bureaucrats, sure, but just bureaucrats nonetheless. Because the Holy Office was a court, all these administrators had to be trained lawyers, not fanatics. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of the administration of the Inquisition was its totally inadequate funding. Though technically a Spanish governmental agency, the Spanish monarchs left it to fend for itself. The Inquisition, in fact, never received a fixed source of revenue. So the Inquisition had to finance itself, and that, my friends, very much dictated how it operated. The incentive was to find people guilty so that you could confiscate their wealth. As you can imagine, that relationship set a very bad precedent. Not surprisingly, many Spaniards came to the conclusion that the Inquisition existed solely to rob people of their wealth. In fact, one resident of Cuenca lamented, quote, "They were burnt only for the money they had. They burn the well off because they have property. The others they leave alone," end quote. Some of this money went to the Spanish crown, though determining exactly how much is impossible. Still, by their very nature, confiscations and sequestrations could never bring in reliable income. The vast majority of all those accused by the Inquisition were people of humble means, and the inquisitors would need to have a regular annual turnover of hundreds of prisoners in order to get anything even close to a substantial revenue. Windfalls, like a couple of the great persecutions in the 1680s, well, those were exceptions to the rule. The normal picture would have been of tribunals desperately trying to find income for the costs of administration, prosecution, maintenance of prisoners, and increasingly expensive active faiths. The documentation is full of complaints by local inquisitors that they cannot provide either for themselves or for their prisoners. The regular state of deficit in the tribunals can be seen in the statements of income and expenses for the years 1618, 1671 through 78, and 1705. Income in Granada in 1618, for example, was 3% more than costs. But in 1671, costs were actually 3% higher than income. And in fact, by the time we get to 1705, the Inquisition was running in the red with 27% more costs than income. The figures leave no doubt that the Inquisition was often in perilous financial straits. The most critical source of income for the Inquisition was investment income, or as the sources refer to it, senos. Now, that being said, even with this income, the institution was never wealthy. The estates that it held at the end of the 18th century, when the Inquisition finally came to an end, were of modest value at best. Still, in 1573, 74% of the Inquisition's income came from these censos, and in 1576, that number had risen to 80%. It's really interesting that the Crown never chose to support an institution that it saw primarily as its tool. But that is the case. Regardless, later historians came to regard the Inquisition as a secular rather than ecclesiastical institution. They weren't wrong. The Suprema was a Spanish government council. The Crown had absolute power to appoint and dismiss inquisitors, everyone except the Inquisitor General. So interestingly, at least from a superficial perspective, the papacy was never willing to concede this reality. The papacy went along, continuing to confirm the Inquisition's jurisdiction as though it had a lot of influence over the body, which it didn't. And for its part, the Inquisition seemed content to hedge its bet and claim both royal and papal jurisdiction. Inevitably, as a result of its secular nature, the Inquisition became involved in a series of political disputes. King Ferdinand endeavored to use it as a political lever as much as possible, though it's arguable as to whether he honestly ever got anything out of it. The biggest example would be Cesare Borgia. He tried to use the Inquisition to prosecute Cesare, but his death in battle in 1507 removed our best test case for just how much the Inquisition might have helped the king pursue his political enemies. Now let's turn for a bit to how the Inquisition operated. The coming of the Inquisition to a town was, in principle, designed to cause fear. In his commentary on the 14th century, Manuel of Emmerich stated, quote, "We must remember that the main purpose of the trial and execution is not to save the soul of the accused, but to achieve public good and put fear into others." End quote. The public activity of the Holy Office was thus based on the premise, common to all policing systems, that fear was the best deterrent. When the inquisitors began operations in a district, they would first present their credentials to the local church and secular authorities, then announce a Sunday or a feast day when the residents would have to go to High Mass, together with their children and servants, to hear an edict read. At the end of the sermon, or the creed, the inquisitor or his representative would hold a crucifix in front of the congregation and ask everyone to raise their right hand, cross themselves, and repeat after him a solemn oath to support the Inquisition and its ministers. Then he would proceed to read the edict. In the early years, this took the form of an Edict of Grace, modeled on those of the medieval Inquisition, which recited a list of heresies and invited those who wished to discharge their consciences to come forward and denounce themselves or others. If they came forward within the, quote, period of grace, end quote, this was usually 30 to 40 days, they would be reconciled to the church without suffering serious penalties. Clearly, this system was designed to encourage self-denunciation. In the earlier period, heresies were principally either listed as Judaic or Islamic, though more were added over time. While the Inquisition itself was feared by the population, like all the other tribunals throughout Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, it depended principally on collaboration to succeed. Hence, what most people seemed to fear wasn't that they would be persecuted by the Inquisition, but that they would be denounced by their friends and neighbors. Petty denunciations were the rule rather than the exception. Indeed, for most, the Inquisition became an easy way to settle old scores. The fear the Inquisition generated had its origins in social disharmony. Its records are replete with instances in which neighbors denounced neighbors, friends denounced friends, and so on and so forth. But there was a flip side to this coin. In places where there was less social discord, where the bonds of fellowship were stronger, the Inquisition could not penetrate. In Catalonia, for example, the community utterly rejected the Inquisition's invitation to turn on itself. Hence, in that very insular region of Spain, the institution failed to propagate. As a result, even the inquisitors hated traveling on visitations. They often had to go into counties where they were despised and the local authorities hostile. I wouldn't have wanted to go on these trips either. Still, inquisitors spent about half their time traveling on visitations. These were generally done out in the villages where few trials ever took place. Nor were these visitations effective. The Inquisition simply did not have the resources to do them with enough frequency to make them potent expressions of its power. It was easy for distant villagers to weather the occasional visitation and simply move on with their lives. For as much vile as is often heaped on the Inquisition, the men running it weren't fanatical idiots. They could and often did distinguish between true and false cases, and would reject those denunciations made out of pure malice and without a grain of truth to them. Judicially, honestly, the Inquisition was on par with the secular courts of the time. It wasn't worse, and it wasn't more vicious. I suppose there was one exception. Witnesses' names were concealed in the inquisitional courts. And, of course, this did increase the incentive for people to come forward. Before an arrest took place, the evidence in the case was presented to a number of theologians, who acted as consultants or assessors, to determine whether the charges involved heresy. If they decided that there was sufficient proof, the prosecutor, actually called the fiscal, drew up a demand for the arrest of the accused, who was taken into custody. Such at least were the rules, but in numerous cases, arrest preceded the examination, so that all the preliminary safeguards against wrongful arrest were dispensed with. As a result, prisoners wound up sitting in inquisitorial jails without any charges ever having been produced against them. Making matters worse, arrest was accompanied by the immediate seizure of goods held by the accused prior to conviction. This could include everything, down to your pots, pans, and, in some cases, we have documentation to show, the cutlery. The arrested person was immediately taken to the Inquisition prison. Inquisition prisons were actually better than secular ones, which explains why the populace preferred them to royal prisons or even ordinary ecclesiastical ones. Still, if you had your druthers, you didn't want to go to prison at all because prisoners were cut off from communication from the outside world, and their accommodations were often overcrowded. Insanity and suicide were regular consequences of such imprisonment. When necessary, interrogations took place in the presence of a notary, who recorded as much as possible. Sadly, because the Inquisition was in this nasty habit of destroying its records, we have little of these remaining today. The use of torture, inherited from the medieval Inquisition, was not considered an end in and of itself. The instructions of 1561 laid down no rules for its use, but urged that its application should be according to, quote, the conscience and will of the appointed judges. Following law, reason, and good conscience, inquisitors should take great care that the sentence of torture is justified and follows precedent. End quote. At a time when the use of torture was universal in European criminal courts, the Spanish Inquisition followed a policy of circumspection that makes it compare favorably with other institutions. Torture was normally used as a last resort and applied in only a minority of cases. Often the accused was merely placed in the sight of the torture instruments to provoke a confession. Confessions gained under torture were never accepted as valid because they had obviously been obtained by pressure. It was therefore essential for the accused to ratify his confession the day after the ordeal. If he refused to do this, a legal trick was involved. As the rules forbade anyone to be tortured more than once, the end of every torture session was treated as a suspension, and a refusal to ratify the confession would be met with a threat to continue the torture. Besides being compelled to confess their own heresies, accused were often tortured to confess the crimes of others. Now, of course, in statistical terms, it would be correct to say that torture was used infrequently. Out of more than 400 conversos tried by one tribunal, only 2 were known to have been tortured. Torture was employed exclusively to elicit punishment and never used as a punishment. Physicians, interestingly, were usually on hand in case of an emergency. The basic rule in torture was that the accused should suffer no damage to life or limb. By church law, ecclesiastical tribunes could not kill, nor were they allowed to shed blood. No distinctive tortures were used by the Inquisition. Those most often employed were in common use in other secular and ecclesiastical tribunals, and any complaints of novel tortures would certainly refer to rare exceptions. The three main ones were the garachu, toca, and porto. The garacha, or pulley, involved being hung by the wrists from a pulley on the ceiling, with heavy weights attached to the feet. The accused was raised slowly and then suddenly allowed to fall with a jerk. The effect was to stretch and perhaps dislocate arms and legs. The toca, or water torture, was more complicated. The accused was tied down in a rack, his mouth kept forcibly open, and a toca, or linen cloth, was put down his throat to conduct water poured slowly from a jar. The severity of the torture varied with the number of jars of water used. The porto, which was the most common after the 16th century, involved being bound tightly on a rack by cords, which were passed around the body, and limbs were controlled by the executioner, who tightened them by turns of the cords at the end. With each turn, the cords bit into the body and traveled around the flesh. In all these tortures, it was the rule to strip the accused first. Both men and women were stripped naked and left with minimal garments to cover themselves. While the Inquisition did not usually subject the very old or very young to torture, there were cases where that happened. In fact, there are some records of women between the ages of 70 and 90 having been tortured. It was also standard practice at the time to write down all the details of torture for the record, although, again, we have lost many of these. In terms of the actual trial process, since the Inquisition normally arrested subjects only after the evidence against them seemed conclusive and had been approved, the accused was naturally presumed guilty from the start, and it fell on him to prove his own innocence. The sole task of the Inquisition was to obtain from its prisoner an admission of guilt. If in the process of inquiry it found that the evidence was false and the prisoner presumably innocent, he was immediately set free. The main task of the tribunal, however, was to act not as a court of justice, but as a disciplinary body called into existence to meet a national emergency. In these circumstances, and considering the practice of the time, the courts of the Inquisition were adequate for this task. Apart from the much-hated insistence on the secrecy of witnesses, in broad terms, they conformed to the principles of the courts of Castile. One of the peculiarities of the inquisitorial procedure, which brought hardship and suffering to many, was the refusal to divulge the reason for your arrest, so that prisoners went for days and months without knowing why they were in the cells of the tribunal at all. Instead of accusing the prisoner, the inquisitors would approach him and give 3 warnings over a period of weeks to search his conscience, confess the truth, and trust to the mercy of the Inquisition. The 3rd warning was accompanied by information that the prosecutor intended to present an accusation, and that it would be wise to confess before the charges were laid bare. The effect of this enforced ignorance was to depress and break down a prisoner. If innocent, he would be bewildered about what to confess, or else confess crimes the Inquisition was not even accusing him of. If he was guilty, he'd be left to wonder how much of the truth the Inquisition really knew, and whether it was a trick to force him to confess. When, after 3 warnings, the prosecutor eventually read the articles of accusation, the accused was required to answer charges on the spot, with no time or advocate to help him present his defense. Any reply made in these circumstances could hardly fail to incriminate himself. Only after this was permission given to enlist legal help for the defense. One important concession made by the Spanish, but not by the medieval Inquisition, was that the accused could have the services of an advocate. This was written into the instructions of 1484 and generally upheld, though later modifications to the rule sometimes rendered the use of a lawyer farcical. In the early years, the accused could choose their lawyers freely, but the growing caution of the Holy Office later confined the choice to special lawyers nominated by the tribunal. So that, by the mid-16th century, the prisoners' advocates were recognized as officials of the Inquisition, dependent on and working with the inquisitors. This new class of lawyers was obviously distrusted by some prisoners, for in 1559, we have a case of a prisoner in Valencia telling his cellmate, quote, "Though the inquisitor might give him an advocate, he would give him no one good but a fellow who would only do what the Inquisition wanted. And if by chance he asked for an advocate or solicitor not of the Inquisition, they would not serve, for if they went contrary to the inquisitor's wishes, he would get up to some charge of false belief or want of respect and cast them into prison." End quote. Now, this does not mean that those advocates assigned as defense didn't do their duty consciously, but they were, of course, hindered by the restrictions of the tribunal and the subtle and dangerous task of defending the prisoner while condemning his heresy. Some special cases exist where counsel were allowed of their own choice, but these were exceptions. When a prisoner was finally accused, he was given a copy of the evidence against him in order to help him prepare a defense. This publication of the evidence was by no means as helpful as it might be today. In the first place, the names of all the witnesses were stricken. Even more important, all evidence that might help identify witnesses was stricken from the record. This meant the prisoner was also just deprived of any details of the complete case against him. In this way, the inquisitors were free to use as evidence information that had not been communicated to the accused. While this helped protect witnesses against identification and recrimination, it often crippled the defense. The accused had several avenues of defense short of proving the complete falsity of an accusation. He could call favorable witnesses, disable hostile witnesses by proving personal enmity, or object to his judges. This was a last resort. Several extenuating circumstances such as drunkenness, insanity, extreme youth, and so on and so forth could also be pleaded. All these expedients were resorted to regularly, but not always with equal success. In the great majority of trials before the Spanish Inquisition, the defense consisted solely in the resort to witnesses, since this was the only way to get to unknown sources of evidence. Hence, for the accused to resort to favorable witnesses was a dicey proposition at best. A defendant's best chance was to undercut the credibility of a hostile witness. Accusations were often made more out of malice than religious zeal for the truth. It wasn't hard in many cases for the defendant to show the financial gain the accusers might hope to gain if they cooperated. Defendants might also call, as I said, for the judges to recuse themselves, but this was extremely risky. If they did not, well, then you might as well just confess. And given the almost complete lack of oversight, it should not shock you that only rarely did one resort to this defense. Now, there was no such thing as a single trial in the period of the Inquisition. Rather, over a period of time, the prosecution and defense would present evidence and arguments until each side declared itself done. Then a quote-unquote consultation was formed. These consisted of one of the inquisitors, one representative of the local bishop, and one theologian. Together they voted. If the inquisitor and the bishop's representative agreed, then the matter was decided. If not, more representatives might be called in and another vote held. Of course, the obvious problem with all this was that the Inquisition was both judge, prosecution, and, in most cases, defense. Hence, the high conviction rate. As a rule, tribunals did try to bring cases to trial quickly. It was expensive to keep people locked up. But in some cases, there was very little the Inquisition could do. In 1590, in Lerna, for example, some prisoners had to wait 7 years for a trial because of the sheer number of the denunciations. This was not the Inquisition's fault per se, but it was another indication of why its poor funding was a major issue for everyone. It is very difficult to say anything specific about the punishments meted out by the Inquisition with any degree of certainty. For the first few years, nearly all the documentation of the Inquisition no longer exists. Beyond that, records are incomplete at best. In the Tribunal of Valencia, an estimate for 3,075 of the trials between 1566 and 1609 suggests that they concluded as follows. 44% of those were penanced, 40% were reconciled, 2% absolved, 9% received suspended sentences, 2.1% were burnt in effigy, 2% were burnt in person. In Galicia, between 1560 and 1700, of 2,203 people, 18% were absolved, 62% were penanced, 61% were reconciled, 2% were burnt in effigy, and less than 1% were burnt in person. To be penanced was the least of the punishments imposed. Those who did penance had to, quote, abjure, end quote, their offenses spiritually for a lesser offense. The penitent swore to avoid his sin in the future, and if he swore again and committed it, any relapse made him liable for severe punishment on the next occasion. Penitents were then condemned to physical penalties, sometimes also fine, banishment, or even the galleys. Reconciliation was, in theory, the return of the sinner to the church after due spiritual penance had been performed. In practice, it was the most severe punishment the Inquisition could inflict, short of being burnt. All the penalties were heavier in reconciliation. In addition to any physical punishment, accused persons could also be condemned to flogging, to long spells in prison, or the galleys. In most cases, confiscation of goods occurred, so that even if the prisoner escaped with a prison sentence of a few months, he came out of an Orthodox Catholic, but, facing a life of being a beggar. An additional rule frequently enforced was that anyone who committed a further offense after reconciliation was to be treated as a relapsed heretic and would be burnt at the stake. Now, most of the punishments involved something that was called the San Benito, which is a corrupt form of older words, Sacro Benito. It's a penitential garment used in the medieval Inquisition and ultimately taken over by the Spanish one. It was usually yellow, with 1 or 2 diagonal crosses imposed on it. Penitents were condemned to wear the San Benito as a mark of infamy for a period of a few months, or in some cases, for life. Those who were to appear at the auto de fe, or the acts of faith, had to wear a black San Benito, on which there were painted flames and demons and other interesting decorations. Anyone condemned to wearing the ordinary yellow San Benito had to put it on whenever he or she went outside, a practice by no means popular in the first few years of the Inquisition. Now, the order to wear a San Benito for life, though, wasn't literal. It was ultimately and invariably commuted to a much shorter period at the discretion of the Inquisitor. The chief criticism leveled at the time against these garments was less over the deliberate shame they were meant to cast on their wearers than on the policy of perpetuating infamy by hanging them up in the local church as a permanent record of the offense. The imprisonment decreed by the Inquisition could be for a short term of months and years, or even for life, the latter usually being classified as, quote, perpetual and irremissible, end quote. Prison sentences, then as now, were not literally observed. By the 17th century, perpetual prison normally signified a few months, and rarely involved imprisonment for more than 3 years, especially if the prisoner was repentant. A lifetime sentence was normally completed in 10 years. Despite this, the Inquisition continued to decree perpetual sentences, probably because in canon law, it was the custom to condemn heretics to life imprisonment. None of the sentences necessarily involved actual confinement in a prison. By the instructions of 1488, inquisitors could, at their discretion, confine a man to his own house or to some other institution, such as a monastery or hospital, with the result that many prisoners served their sentences in moderate comfort. The main reason for this surprising concession was that the tribunals lacked the prison space, because their cells were already full, and it was also just too expensive to keep people in prison for lengthy periods of time. Remember, what we're talking about with the Inquisition is very much an unfunded mandate. Important prisoners normally underwent house arrest rather than imprisonment. Oddly, even when prison itself was the sentence, it was very much an open-door policy. Prisoners were free to go, often during the day, and go about their business. They just had to return to I guess I'll keep calling it a prison, at night. The galleys were a punishment unknown to the medieval Inquisition. These were devised by King Ferdinand, and there was a reason. King Ferdinand wanted a cheap source of labor for his navy without having to resort to open slavery. By the mid-18th century, the Inquisition had ceased using galley terms as sentences, as it had, for the sake of argument, the Spanish crown and secular courts. Interestingly, an accused might be sentenced to different punishments simultaneously. For example, one accused in Granada in 1672 was sentenced to 4 years banishment, 6 years in the galley, and 100 strokes of the lash. Unfortunately, based on the record, I couldn't tell if the first two punishments, the galleys and banishment, were consecutive or concurrent. That is, whether they were served simultaneously or he was banished and then served 6 years in the galleys. Of course, the ultimate penalty was burning at the stake. The execution of heretics was by the 15th century such a commonplace event in Christendom that the Spanish Inquisition cannot be accused of any innovation. It had been the practice hallowed by the medieval Inquisition for the church courts to condemn a heretic and then hand him over or, quote-unquote, relax him to the secular authorities. These were then obliged to carry out the sentence of blood, which the Holy Office was forbidden by law to carry out. In all of this, there was no pretense that the Inquisition was not the body fully and directly responsible for the deaths that occurred. Two classes of people qualified for the stake: unrepentant heretics and relapsed heretics. The latter consisted of those who, after being pardoned a first time, had repeated the offense and were adjudged to have relapsed into heresy. Those who were sentenced did not always die at the stake. They were normally given the choice between repenting before the auto de fe reached its climax, in which case they were mercifully strangled when the flames were lit, or you could remain unrepentant, in which case you were burnt alive. The vast majority of those who were burned, in fact, were burnt in effigy only, because they had either died before the act or the auto de fe, or because they had saved themselves by fleeing. In the early years of the Inquisition, the large number of accused burnt in effigy testifies to the number of refugees escaping from the tribunal. The proportionately small number of executions is an effective argument against the legend of the bloodthirsty tribunal. Nothing certainly can efface the horror of the terrible first 20 or so years, but it is far from clear that the Inquisition was the juggernaut of death that is oftentimes assumed it to be. Still, we do need to remember that while the overall death rate was low, it fell disproportionately on people of Jewish and Muslim origin. Executions probably had a minor impact on the population at large, but were a significant burden on the conversos. Most Europeans knew the Inquisition because of the acts of faith, or as they were called at the time, autos de fe. These were the public condemnation ceremonies that combined preaching, prayer, denunciations, verdicts, and sentences. People flocked to see them. They were truly a novelty throughout Europe, truly uniquely Spanish. The auto de fe in its heyday was an event without parallel. Visitors from other countries would throng in when it was announced one would be held. The auto de fe in 1610 at Lorongo attracted, according to an official of the Inquisition, 30,000 people from countries like France, Aragon, Navarre, Basque Country, and Castile. Since the town had only a population of 4,000, the number of visitors would have created a memorable and historic impression, though the number is clearly exaggerated. The scene would invariably be set at the biggest square or public space available. The elaborate and impressive staging of the proceedings, depicted clearly in prints of the period, made for heavy expense, and because of this autos de fe were not frequent. Their frequency depended entirely on the discretion of the individual tribunals and the availability of prisoners. When necessary, prisoners could be brought from the very ends of the peninsula. For the great 1680 auto in Madrid, condemned were brought in from Galicia and Andalusia. When enough prisoners had accumulated to make the holding of an act of faith worthwhile, a date was fixed for the event, and the inquisitors informed the authorities of the municipality and the cathedral. One calendar month before the auto de fe, a procession consisting of familiars and notaries of the Inquisition would march through the streets of the town, proclaiming the date of the ceremony. Orders went out to carpenters and masons to prepare the scaffolding for the occasion, and decorations were made ready. The evening before the auto de fe, a special proceeding took place, known as the Procession of the Green Cross, during which familiars and others carried the cross of the Holy Office to the site of the ceremony. All that night, prayers and preparations were made. Then early the next morning, Mass was celebrated, breakfast was given to all who appeared in the auto de fe, including those condemned, and a procession began, which led directly to the square where it would be held. There is one contemporary account of the first auto de fe held in Toledo on Sunday, the 12th of February, 1486, during which over 700 Jews were reconciled to the church. At this early epoch, ceremonial and ritual were notably absent. The inquisitors were occupied solely with the task of reconciling large number of heretics quickly and efficiently. Here's the account. All the reconciled went in procession, to the number of persons 750, including both men and women. They went in procession from the church of St. Peter Martyr in the following way. The men were all together in a group, bareheaded and unshod, and since it was extremely cold, they were told to wear soles under their feet, which were otherwise bare. In their hands were unlit candles. The women were together in a group, their heads uncovered and their faces bare, unshod like the men when with candles. Among all these were many prominent men in high office. With the bitter cold and dishonor and disgrace they suffered from the great number of spectators, they went along, howling loudly and weeping and tearing out their hair, no doubt more for the dishonor they were suffering than for any offense they had committed against God. Thus they went in tribulation through the streets along which the Corpus Christi procession goes, until they came to the cathedral. At the door of the church were two chaplains who made the sign of the cross on each other's forehead, saying, quote, "Receive the sign of the cross which you denied and lost through being deceived," end quote. Then they went into the church, until they arrived at a scaffolding erected by a new gate, and on it were the further inquisitors. Nearby was another scaffolding, on which stood an altar at which they said Mass and delivered a sermon. After this, a notary stood up and began to call each one by name. Quote, "Is X here?" End quote. The penitent would raise his candle and say yes. There in the public they read all the things which he had done. The same was done for the women. When this was over, they were publicly allotted penance and ordered to go in procession for 6 Fridays, including scourging their bodies, barebacked, unshod, and bareheaded. They were to also fast for those 6 Fridays. It was also ordered that all the days of their life they were to hold no public office or to be public scriveners or messengers, and that those who held public office were to lose them, and that they were not to become money changers, shopkeepers, or grocers, or hold any post whatsoever. They were not to wear silk or scarlet or colored cloth or gold or silver or pearls or any jewels, nor could they stand as witnesses. And they were ordered that if they relapsed, that is, if they fell into the same error again, and resorted to any of the forementioned things, they would be condemned to the fire. And when all this was over, they went away. It was 2:00 in the afternoon. End quote. Burning at the stake was even rarer. We have one following account from the auto de fe held at Lorongo in August 1719. Around the Jew are a number of religious people who, quote, press the accused with great anxiety and zeal to convert himself. With perfect serenity, he said, I will convert myself to the faith of Jesus Christ. Words which he had not been heard to utter until then. This overjoyed all the religious, who began to embrace him with tenderness, and gave finite thanks to God for having opened them a door for his conversion. And as he was making his confession of faith, a learned religious man of the Franciscan order asked him, In what law do you die? He turned and looked him in the eye and said, Father, I have already told you that I die in the faith of Jesus Christ. This caused great pleasure and joy among all, and the Franciscan, who was kneeling down, arose and embraced the accused. All the others did the same, with great satisfaction, giving thanks for the finite goodness of God. At this moment, the accused saw the executioner, who had put his head out from behind the stake, and asked him, Why did you call me a dog before? The executioner replied, Because you denied the faith of Jesus Christ. But now that you have confessed, we are brothers. And if I have offended you by what I said, I beg pardon on my knees. The accused forgave him gladly, and the two embraced. And desirous that the soul, which had given so many signs of conversion, would not be lost, I went round casually behind the stake to where the executioner was, and gave him the order to strangle him immediately, because it was very important not to delay. This he did with great expedition. When it was certain he was dead, the executioner was ordered to set fire at the four corners of the pyre to the brushwood and charcoal that had been piled up. He did this at once, and it began to burn on all sides, the flames rising swiftly up the platform and burning the wood and clothing. When the cords binding the accused had been burnt off, he fell through the open trapdoor into the pyre, and his whole body was reduced to ashes. End quote. There was no age limit for those condemned to the stake. Women in their 80s and boys in their teens were treated the same. By the mid-16th century, acts of faith, autos de fe, were so rare that they had become essentially once-in-a-lifetime events. By the second half of that century, they had become obsolete. Only private acts of faith happened during those 30-odd years. Perhaps, as one commenter dryly observed, the heretics had been purged out of existence. So that's it for our look at the Inquisition in general. Next week, we return to our Galileo story to wrap up his trial and his confrontation, I suppose, with the Inquisition. Spoiler alert, he's not going to be burned at the stake. Now, as always, if you're looking for more Western Civ, I've got links in the show notes. I have changed a little bit how the support works. We've gone down to just the Patreon account because it's just much easier and it's cheaper, and I'm able to get out additional shows much, much faster for those who are willing to support. And as always, I appreciate it. If you can't support the show financially, but you'd like to do something, a rating and review is always greatly appreciated.